The morning Eliza Calloway arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana, the year was 1874, and the first thing she noticed was that the land was so vast and so indifferent to human suffering that it almost took her breath clean away. She had stepped off the back of a wagon driven by a grizzled freight hauler named Hector Plum, who had been kind enough to give her a ride from the last town after her horse had thrown a shoe and gone lame 2 days back. Hector had not asked too many questions, which she had appreciated greatly, because the answers would have taken longer than the ride and left her too hollowed out to function. She had simply climbed onto the bench beside him, tucked her carpet bag between her boots, and watched the pine-covered mountains rise up around the trail like walls closing in on something that desperately wanted to be safe. Harlan Creek was not a glamorous place. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of the Bitterroot Range, a rough cluster of wooden buildings that looked as though the wind had blown them there by accident and forgotten to blow them away again. There was a general store run by a round-faced woman named Mabel Hutchins, a blacksmith's operation that smelled of coal smoke and hot iron, a single-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, a saloon called the Broken Spur that smelled of things Eliza had no desire to identify, and perhaps 30 or 40 houses scattered along the single main road and up into the tree line. It was, by any standard she had known in Virginia, a very small and very humble place, but it was hers now, or rather, it was the closest thing to hers that remained. Her father had left her a parcel of land in his will, signed over before his death from fever the previous winter. 40 acres along the eastern edge of the valley, where a creek called Dawson's Fork ran cold and clear through a stand of aspens and Douglas firs. There was a cabin on it, small but solid, built by her father's own hands when he had come west 12 years ago, chasing a dream about cattle and clean air. He had never quite found his fortune, but he had found the land, and now the land was hers. She had come to make something of it. She was 24 years old. She had no husband, no siblings, and no intention of depending on anyone for a single thing she could build or grow or earn with her own 2 hands. She had packed everything she owned into 1 carpet bag and 1 trunk that she had left in the care of Hector Plum until she could arrange to have it brought out to the property. She had a dog-eared copy of a gardening almanac that had belonged to her mother, a small jar of seeds she had been saving for 2 years, and the kind of stubborn, quiet determination that people sometimes mistake for coldness, but is actually just someone who has learned to stop asking the world for more than it intends to give. The first person she met in Harlan Creek was Mabel Hutchins, who took one look at her through the window of the general store and came outside to introduce herself before Eliza had even had time to decide whether she wanted to go in. Mabel was somewhere in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of iron and eyes that were sharp in a kind sort of way, like a woman who had seen too much to be easily fooled, but had also seen enough goodness to still be willing to extend a hand. "You must be Martin Calloway's daughter," Mabel said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I heard you were coming. I'm Mabel. I run the store. Come in and get yourself something warm to drink. You look like you've been riding the open road since last Tuesday." "Something close to that," Eliza admitted, and followed her inside. The store smelled of dried beans and leather, and the faint sweetness of horehound candy kept in a glass jar by the counter. Mabel poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been sitting on a small iron stove in the back, and Eliza wrapped both hands around her cup and let the warmth soak into her fingers, while Mabel leaned against the counter and looked her over with the frank, evaluating expression of a woman cataloging what needed to be done. "Your father's cabin is in decent shape," Mabel said. "Old Jonah McCready checked on it this past spring when we heard you were coming. Roof holds, fireplace draws. You'll need to clear the brush away from the east wall before summer gets too dry or you'll be a fire risk, but that's manageable. The creek is running high right now from the snowmelt, which is good. That whole stretch of property gets good light in the morning and evening both." "I know," Eliza said. "He wrote me about it quite a lot in his letters." Mabel's expression softened just slightly at that. "He was a good man, your father. Quiet. Did what he said he would do. We'll miss him around here." Eliza took a slow sip of her coffee. "Thank you." "Now," Mabel said, settling into the businesslike tone of someone who recognizes when sentiment has run its useful course and practicality needs to take over. There are a few things you ought to know about that property before you go riding out there and find out the hard way. The land is good, but it's wild country, and you'll be about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. The deer come down from the ridge in the evenings, particularly in late spring and early summer, and they will eat anything green you try to grow out there. Your father tried to start a kitchen garden 3 times, and 3 times the deer got into it before he could harvest a single thing. He put up a low rail fence once, but they just stepped right over it. Eliza felt something firm settle in her chest. I'll manage the deer. Mabel looked at her with the expression of someone who respects determination while privately calculating its odds. You might also want to introduce yourself to the man who lives at the top of the eastern ridge. His name is Colt Mercer. He came up here from Wyoming Territory about 4 years ago. He runs a trap line in the winter, does some timber work, sells hides. He knows every inch of that forest, and he knows where the trouble comes from. If you ever find yourself in a bind out there, he is the person to know. A trapper, Eliza said, not quite approvingly or disapprovingly, simply noting the category. A mountain man, Mabel said, and there was something in the way she said it, a small weight of meaning, that made Eliza look at her more carefully. Keeps mostly to himself, doesn't drink at the Broken Spur more than twice a month, doesn't pick fights, pays what he owes. He's a good neighbor to have, even if he is a little rough around the edges. Brought old Mrs. Werner a whole haunch of venison last winter when she was laid up sick and couldn't get to town. Never said a word about it to anyone, she told me. Eliza tucked that information away, somewhere between useful and interesting. I'll keep it in mind, she said. She finished her coffee, bought a few basic supplies on credit, which Mabel extended without question or condition, and then walked the 2 miles out to her father's property in the cool afternoon air, her carpet bag bumping against her thigh with every step. The cabin was everything her father's letters had described, and also somehow more real than any description could have made it. It sat in a small clearing back from the creek, surrounded by the thick resinous smell of fir trees and the sound of running water. The walls were hewn log, tight-fitted and chinked with river clay that had dried pale gray. The roof was split-shake shingle. The front door faced south, and the single window beside it caught the afternoon light and held it in a warm rectangle across the plank floor. At the back of the cabin there was a door that opened onto a small clearing where the soil was dark and rich-looking, where once, probably, her father had planned to grow vegetables before the deer had made him give up the idea entirely. She stood in the back doorway for a long time, looking at that patch of ground. It was perhaps 20 feet by 30, roughly rectangular, bounded on the far end by the beginning of the tree line. The soil looked good, deep and dark with the promise of things growing. She could see the ghost of the old rail fence her father had tried, 3 gray posts still sticking up at odd angles, the rails long since fallen and rotting back into the earth. She was going to have a garden, a real one. She had been carrying those seeds for 2 years, and she was going to put them in that ground, and something was going to grow, and no deer in the state of Montana was going to stop her. She just needed to figure out how to build a fence that would actually work. The next morning she woke before dawn, built a fire in the iron stove, made herself porridge from the oats she had bought from Mabel, and then spent an hour with her almanac and a piece of paper, sketching out what she thought a proper deer-proof fence ought to look like. She had read about it in passing in one of the farming pamphlets her father had sent along with his letters, something about height being the key factor, that a deer could jump a fence up to 4 feet without much effort, but would think more carefully about anything approaching 5 or 6 feet. She did not have the lumber for that kind of fence. She did not, if she was honest, have the physical strength to drive posts and string wire over 20 feet of fencing by herself, though she was fully prepared to try. She went out and measured the clearing with a length of rope, marked the corners with stones, and spent the afternoon trying to work out what she needed and what it would cost and how she was going to make this work. By evening she had a plan that was theoretically sound and practically daunting, and she went to bed with the almanac open on her chest and the sound of the creek coming through the window and the particular ache of someone who is doing something hard and right. She spent 3 days settling in, clearing the brush from the east wall as Mabel had advised, cleaning out the cabin, hauling water, learning the rhythms of the property. On the 4th morning, she walked the perimeter of the clearing and found, pressed into the soft mud near the tree line, the fresh tracks of 3 deer, large and certain. They had been coming down from the ridge during the night, nosing along the edge of the clearing, finding nothing yet but clearly noting the location for future reference. It made her both angry and more determined. On the 5th day, she walked up the ridge. She was not entirely sure she was going the right way, but Mabel had mentioned that Colt Mercer's cabin was at the top of the eastern ridge, and there was only one clear trail heading up in that direction, a narrow path through the firs that looked like it had been walked 1,000 times by someone with a long and purposeful stride. She followed it upward through the trees, past a cold spring that came out of the rock face and pooled in a natural basin ringed with bright green moss, past a deadfall where someone had stacked the cut sections of timber neatly at the side of the trail, past a place where a large pine had come down in some past storm and been cut through cleanly to keep the path open. The cabin appeared at the edge of a broad rocky ledge where the trees thinned out and the sky opened up wide and blue above. It was a bigger structure than her own, and clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing with timber and stone. The walls were full round logs, not hewn flat, and they were massive, the kind of wood that did not bend and did not apologize. The stone chimney was perfectly vertical and mortared so cleanly you could barely see the joints. Beside the cabin there was a lean-to storage structure with a proper split-shingle roof, a wood yard with a splitting stump and an axe buried in it, and several long wooden racks hung with the drying hides of what looked like beaver, marten, and one large elk. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of something very heavy being moved came from the far side of the cabin, a low grunt of effort, the scrape of stone on stone, and then a heavy thud. She walked around the corner and stopped. He was building something with the stone, some kind of low retaining wall along the edge of the ledge, and he was doing it with his bare hands and arms, hauling rocks that she estimated weighed 60 or 70 pounds as though they were firewood. He was enormous, was the first coherent thought she managed, not in any cartoonish way, but in the way of a man who had spent years doing physical work in a hard landscape and whose body had responded accordingly. He stood well over 6 feet with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out a meaningful portion of the mountain sky behind him. His arms were corded with muscle from wrist to shoulder, the kind of muscle that came from genuine labor rather than any kind of vanity. He wore a simple canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pair of worn canvas trousers, and heavy boots. His hair was the dark brown of river mud, and it fell past his collar, thick and a little wild, pushed back from his face without much ceremony. He had a beard trimmed just enough to suggest it was intentional, a jaw that could have been cut from the same stone he was moving, and green eyes that, when he looked up at her with complete surprise and zero alarm, were the color of the shadowed fir trees just below the snow line. He straightened up slowly and regarded her. She had the distinct impression of being evaluated very thoroughly and very quickly, not in a rude way, but in the way of a man who spent a great deal of time alone in the wilderness and had developed very efficient systems for reading what was in front of him. "You're Martin Calloway's daughter," he said. His voice was low and quiet, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. "Eliza Calloway," she said, and extended her hand the way she would have extended it to any man she was meeting as a neighbor and equal. "I moved onto the Calloway property 5 days ago." He wiped his hand on his trousers and shook hers. His hand was immense and completely engulfed hers, and his grip was firm but careful in a way that told her he was aware of his own strength. "Colt Mercer." "I know," she said. "Mabel Hutchins mentioned you might be a useful person to know." Something moved in his expression, a flicker of what might have been amusement and might have been something else. "Mabel mentions that to most people who settle out this way." "I came to ask you something," Eliza said, "if you have a minute." "I have time," he said, and set down the stone he had been about to place, and gave her his full attention in a way that felt, oddly, like being stood in direct sunlight after a long time in the shade. She explained about the garden. She explained about the deer tracks she had found, the 3 failed attempts her father had made, the measurements she had taken, the fence design she had sketched out. She explained what she had and what she did not have and what she was trying to accomplish. She spoke efficiently and without asking for sympathy, just laying out the problem and the goal, the way she always did when she wanted to be taken seriously. He listened without interrupting, which was already more than most men did. When she finished, He was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance with an expression of quiet calculation. "You'd want posts at least 6 feet above ground," he said. "Posts themselves would need to be 8 feet, maybe 8.5, to give you enough purchase in the earth. White cedar holds up best out here, rot-resistant. I've got cedar timber in the lean-to, cut last fall. Rail or wire between the posts. Wire is better if you want it to last, but wire costs more than you probably want to spend right now if you just arrived. Rail fencing from split cedar would hold them off just as well if you build it right, close enough together that they cannot get a good run at it." He was describing something real and solid and buildable, and she felt a surge of something warm in her chest, the particular feeling of hearing someone take a problem seriously. "I could help you build it," he said, and then almost immediately added, as though the offer had surprised even himself, "if you wanted. I know that wood and I know where the deer come down from. I could build you something that would hold them off for 20 years. She looked at him carefully. There were men who offered help because they wanted gratitude, men who offered help because they wanted company, and men who offered help because they were constitutionally unable to leave a problem unsolved when they could see it clearly. He looked, she thought, like the third kind. "I would want to help build it myself," she said, "not just watch." "That's fine," he said, with the tone of a man who had genuinely not assumed otherwise. "Then I would appreciate it very much," Eliza said. He nodded, already looking toward the tree line as though measuring something. "I'll come down on Saturday. We'll start by marking the corners and cutting the posts." She walked back down the ridge, feeling something she had not felt in a long time, something quietly electric, the sense of a story beginning rather than one already half-finished. Saturday came with a clear sky and a cold morning wind blowing down off the peaks to the north. Eliza had been up since 4, had the stove going, had eaten and pulled on her canvas work gloves and her father's old slouch hat, and was standing in the garden clearing with her measuring rope when she heard the sound of Colt Mercer coming down the trail from the ridge. He was not particularly loud about it, but a man of that size moving through a forest made a particular quality of sound, a deliberate, even sound of someone who moved with real purpose. He emerged from the tree line with a wood axe over one shoulder and a coil of rope over the other, and he was already looking at the clearing with the evaluating gaze of someone reading a problem in 3 dimensions. He was wearing the same canvas work shirt and trousers as before, and in the morning light he looked even larger than she remembered, the muscles of his forearms rolling as he shifted the axe on his shoulder. His dark hair caught the early sun. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said, and set down his axe and the rope and walked the perimeter of the clearing exactly as she had done on her first day, but faster and with greater certainty, pausing in each corner, looking at the soil, looking at the tree line, looking at the approach angles from the ridge above. He crouched in the corner near the east tree line and pressed his fingers into the ground where her garden's edge would be. "This corner here," he said, not looking up, "this is where they come in. See that trail through the undergrowth? That's a deer run. It comes down from a hollow in the ridge about a quarter-mile up. They use it every evening in spring and summer." She came and crouched beside him and looked at it. He was right. She could see the subtle groove of a well-used animal path where it entered the clearing, the grass pressed in a particular direction, a few coarse hairs caught on a low branch. "So this corner needs to be extra solid," she said. "The whole fence needs to be solid," he said, standing and looking out across the clearing. "But yes, this corner especially." He spent the next hour working through the plan with her, drawing it out in the dirt with a stick, showing her where each post would go, explaining the spacing, the depth of the post holes, the way the rails should be mortised rather than just nailed so they would hold against the force of a deer pressing along the fence line. She listened and asked questions and pushed back twice on details she disagreed with, both times because she had read something relevant in the almanac, and both times he considered what she said and adjusted the plan accordingly, without argument and without condescension. She noticed that. It was not the most common quality in a man in 1874. They went into the forest together to select the cedar timber. He had already cut and split enough material, he said, and she was welcome to use what he had in the lean-to, and he would cut more as needed. She followed him back up the ridge trail, through the cool green light of the fir forest, and watched him select the poles with the quick, practiced eye of someone who had been reading timber for years, testing the straightness of each piece by sighting along it, thumping it with one knuckle to listen for the sound of good dense wood. Carrying the timber down took both of them. The cedar posts were heavy and long, and she took one end and he took the other, and they carried them down the ridge trail in a kind of careful, coordinated dance, neither speaking much, but both very aware of where the other was, how they were moving, what the ground was doing underfoot. By the second trip she had learned his rhythm and he had learned hers, and the work became almost effortless, or as effortless as hauling a 40-pound post through a mountain forest could be. By midday, they had all the timber down at the clearing. By mid-afternoon, they had the corner post holes dug, which was the hardest part, requiring a long iron bar to break the harder subsoil and a post hole spade to excavate the loose material. And Colt did the breaking and she did the scooping, and the first corner post went in plumb and solid as a church pillar. He tamped the earth around its base with methodical, powerful blows of a wooden maul, each stroke precise and full, and she watched the muscles of his back move under his shirt and looked away. "You've been quiet a while," he said, not stopping the tamping. "I was thinking about the spacing for the rails," she said, which was not entirely untrue. 4 inches between rails," he said. "A deer can work its nose through a 6-inch gap, and if it can work its nose through it will try to work the rest of itself through. 4 inches is too tight to tempt them." "Smart animals," she said. "Very," he agreed, and drove in the last blow and straightened up and looked at the post with a satisfied expression. "They remember places where they have eaten before. If you let them get into this garden even once, they'll be back every night for the rest of the season trying to get back in." "Then we build this fence right," she said. "Yes," he said, and looked at her, and there was a brief pause that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, the pause of two people who are not yet sure what they are to each other, that they felt it, and both looked away at roughly the same moment. He went home at dusk and came back Sunday morning, and they worked the whole day again, and the fence grew along the south and west edges of the clearing, the cedar posts going in straight and true, and the split rails mortised between them in a close, sturdy lattice. By Sunday evening there were 2 sides done, and the work was far enough along that the shape of the finished thing was clear, and it was a very good fence, solid and square, and already smelling of fresh-cut cedar in the warm end-of-day air. He did not stay for supper either evening, though she had made enough both times on the chance that he might. He simply said good night, shouldered his axe, and walked back up the ridge trail into the darkening trees. She stood at the edge of the clearing watching the tree line after he had gone, listening to the sounds of the mountains settle into evening, and felt something that she recognized as longing and did not quite know what to do with yet. On Monday, she worked on the fence alone, driving in the posts on the north side with the wooden maul, which was harder and slower without him there, but not impossible, because she was stronger than she looked, and she did not stop until the thing was done. By the time the shadows got long, she had the whole north side posted, though she left the rails for when he came back, partly because the rails required more precise work, and partly, if she was honest, because she wanted there to be something left to do together. He came back Tuesday, which was sooner than she had expected, and she did not hide the fact that she was glad. "I thought you might need help with the east side," he said, which was true, because the east side was the deer run corner, the most important section, the one that needed extra care. "I do," she said simply. That morning, as they worked on the close-spaced rails of the east corner, she found herself telling him about Virginia. Not the whole of it, not all the grief and the difficulty, but pieces of it. The way the morning fog lay across the valley in summer, the particular red of the clay soil in autumn, her mother's kitchen garden with its rows of beans and squash, and the riot of sunflowers her mother had always grown along the fence. She had not intended to talk about it, but the work had a kind of loosening effect, the rhythm of cutting and fitting and tamping, giving her hands something to do so that her mouth could move without self-consciousness. He listened in his complete, attentive way, fitting a rail with the ease of long practice. "Your mother's gone too?" he asked when she paused. 3 years ago," she said, "before my father came west." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was said without ceremony or any of the awkward softening that people often put around condolences, just the plain expression of a feeling, and somehow that made it more rather than less. "What about your family?" she asked. He drove the rail home and was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Father died when I was 17, he said. "He was a good man, but not a lucky one. My mother remarried and went east. I came west." He said it with the practiced brevity of someone who has summarized a complicated thing so many times that the summary has become the memory. "How long have you been on the ridge?" 4 years. "Do you like it?" He paused and looked out at the mountains, at the great sweep of ridgeline above the valley where the snow still held on the upper peaks even in late May. "Yes," he said. "It's the first place I've been where the quiet feels like something you can live in instead of something waiting to go wrong." She understood that exactly, and told him so, and he looked at her with an expression that was both surprised and very warm, the expression of someone who has said something private and has had it received without damage. The fence was finished on Wednesday evening. They walked the entire perimeter of it together at the end, checking every post, every rail, every mortise joint, testing each section with their hands and their weight, and it held under everything they asked of it. It was 5.5 feet tall at the lowest point and 6 feet at the corners, built of sweet-smelling cedar split and fitted with craft, and it was, without any question, the most solid deer fence in Harlan Creek. Eliza stood inside it and looked at the dark, good soil of her garden and the fence around it, and felt something large and quiet fill her chest. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it in a way that included more than just the fence. He was standing a little behind her and to the right, and she heard him make a small sound in his throat that might have been agreement or might have been something else. She turned and found him closer than she expected, not uncomfortably close, just close. And he was looking at the fence too, but in a particular way, with the expression of a man who has made something and is allowing himself, just briefly, to be satisfied with it. "That'll hold them," he said. 20 years, easy, maybe more." "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "Really, I mean it." He looked down at her, and there was a moment, one of those moments that exists slightly outside of normal time, where everything was very still and very clear, and she could hear the creek running and the evening wind in the tops of the firs and her own heartbeat. "You're welcome," he said quietly, and then looked away, and the moment stretched and released. She invited him to supper, and this time he accepted. It was a plain meal, beans and salt pork and cornbread baked in the Dutch oven, and she had brewed a pot of good coffee and cut 2 slices of the dried apple pie she had made the day before, from apples she had bought from Mabel. He ate with the unpretentious appetite of a man who had been working hard all day and did not find it necessary to be delicate about it, and she found she liked that, the uncomplicated honesty of someone who was hungry and said so by eating. They talked all through supper and beyond it, sitting at the small wooden table in the lamplight, while the fire in the stove ticked and the spring night pressed cold against the windows. They talked about the land and the seasons, and the ways the mountains shifted character from one month to the next. He told her about the trap line he ran in the winter, up into the high country where the fur-bearing animals were thickest, a circuit of 30-some traps he had positioned over years of learning the watershed. She told him about the garden she was planning, the beds she had already sketched out in her almanac, the seeds she had carried from Virginia, the tomatoes and beans and squash and herbs that she intended to grow. "Tomatoes are tricky up here," he said. "Short season. You'll want to start them inside if you can, get them a head start. But it can be done. There's a woman down in the valley at Swanson's farm who does it every year." "Do you garden?" she asked. Something moved in his expression, a kind of surprised amusement. "I've kept a small plot of root vegetables," he said. "Not what you'd call a proper garden, more like a storage patch." "You should see it grow properly," she said. "There is something about watching a seed you planted come up out of the ground that makes you feel like you understand something about life that you didn't before." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight with an expression she could not entirely read, something attentive and serious and tender all at once. "I believe you," he said. He left at 9 o'clock because the trail up the ridge was better walked in the last light than in full dark, and she stood at the cabin door and watched him go, and felt the night close around the cabin like a hand around something held carefully. She planted her garden that first week of June. She spent 3 days preparing the soil, turning it with a fork, working in the dark river compost she had gathered from the creek bank, leveling the beds with a rake and marking the rows with string and small sticks. She planted tomatoes, which she had started in pots inside the cabin window 3 weeks earlier, and now set out carefully in their prepared bed, staking each one with a short cedar stake from the leftover fence timber. She planted beans along the east fence rail where they could climb, squash in the south corner, herbs in a dense, fragrant cluster near the gate, onions and carrots in long rows down the center. Colt came down the ridge 3 more times that first week, each time with some practical errand as the stated reason, once bringing a load of cedar splits she had not asked for but genuinely needed, once to help her true up the garden gate latch that was not quite catching right, once simply walking by on the way to the creek and stopping to lean on the fence rail and look at what she had planted. She always offered him coffee and he always stayed to drink it, and the conversations grew longer and ranged further each time. By the end of June, the garden was alive. The beans had sent up their first true leaves and were reaching for the fence rails. The squash was throwing out broad, rough-edged leaves in a green sprawl across the south bed. The herbs were dense and aromatic in their corner, the basil and the sage and the thyme filling the inside of the fence with a smell that was like a different and better version of the world. And every morning when she came out and looked at the fence and the growing things inside it, she felt the same quiet, fierce satisfaction. And every morning she looked up at the eastern ridge, at the dark tree line where the trail disappeared into the firs, and thought about the man who lived at the top of it. She had not anticipated this. She had come to Harlan Creek to be independent and self-sufficient, and to prove to herself and to the world that she did not need anyone. And she had found those things and was finding them still. But she had also found Colt Mercer, who was not like any other man she had ever met, and the growing awareness of what she felt about him was something she turned over in her mind in the early mornings when the cabin was still cold and the fire was just starting to take, sitting with her coffee and her almanac and the particular honesty of pre-dawn quiet. She did not rush it. That was not her nature, but she also did not pretend it was not there. In July, a month after she had arrived in Harlan Creek, 3 things happened in fairly quick succession that each moved something forward. The first was the arrival of a man named Gareth Foss, who rode into Harlan Creek on a gray horse and set himself up at the broken spur with a set of extremely nice clothes and the easy manner of someone who was accustomed to being the most impressive person in any room. He was a land agent from back east, which was nothing unusual. There were always land agents coming through the territory in those years as the railroad pushed westward and the land began to acquire a commercial value that it had not had before. What was unusual was that Mr. Foss had a particular interest in the Eastern Valley, in the parcels along the creek, and within 2 days of arriving, he had knocked on Eliza's door with a polished smile and a figure. He wanted to buy her property. He was offering $300, which was not a negligible sum for 1874, and he explained in smooth, reasonable terms that the railroad survey had put a possible line through the Eastern Valley and that the land along the creek might prove very valuable in the coming years, and it might be wise for a young woman alone to take the money now, rather than face the uncertainty of the future out here. She thanked him politely and told him the property was not for sale. He came back 2 days later with $350. She told him the same thing. He came back a third time, on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was going down, and this time his manner was less polished and more insistent, and he stood in her doorway talking about practicality and good sense and the vulnerability of her position in a way that made her jaw set hard and her hands press flat against her thighs. She was in the middle of telling him, with controlled but very clear firmness, that she understood her position perfectly well, and the answer was still no, when she heard boots on the cabin path and looked past Foss to see Colt Mercer coming down the trail from the ridge with an axe over his shoulder and the particular unhurried steadiness of a man who is not in a hurry because he is confident nothing is going to require rushing. He took in the scene at the cabin door with one quick look, the set of Eliza's shoulders, the way Foss was positioned in the doorway, too close, leaning slightly forward with the posture of someone using their physical presence as a form of pressure. "Evening," Colt said, coming up the path at the same even pace. He was looking at Foss with an expression that was entirely neutral and somehow entirely clear. Foss stepped back from the doorway. Colt was a head taller than him, and the width of his shoulders was something you took physical note of in a doorway. "Just finishing a conversation," Foss said, with the reflex smoothness of a man who knows when the room has changed. "Looks finished to me," Colt said simply, and looked at Eliza with a question in his eyes. "Mr. Foss was just leaving," she said. Foss looked between them, recalculated several things in rapid succession, replaced his hat on his head, and said he would be in town through the end of the week if she changed her mind. He rode away on the gray horse with his back very straight, and Eliza exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said. "You'd have managed," he said, which she appreciated because it was true, and it meant he had not come down to rescue her but simply to stand beside her, which was a different and better thing. "I know," she said, "but I'm glad you came anyway." He looked at her with the quiet, green-eyed steadiness that she had come to recognize as his particular version of being moved by something. "I saw him ride out here from the ridge," he said. "Thought I'd come down." "You were watching from the ridge?" she asked. Something shifted slightly in his expression. "I sometimes walk the edge in the evenings," he said carefully. "The light is good up there at dusk." It was not the whole truth, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, and both of them were aware of not saying so, and the awareness of that was its own kind of conversation. She invited him to supper, and this time she had made something better than beans. She had stewed a rabbit with wild onions and dried thyme from the garden and made proper biscuits, and they sat at the table in the lamplight, and the conversation went to places it had not been before, deeper and quieter and more carefully felt. "Why did you really come down tonight?" she asked, at some point after the dishes were cleared and the coffee was poured. He turned his cup in his hands and looked at it. "I don't know that I can fully explain it," he said, "except that the thought of you standing in that doorway with a man like Foss and nobody else around did not sit well with me." "That sounds like something more than neighborly concern," she said. He looked up at her then, directly, and the lamplight caught his green eyes and held them, and he said, "Yes, I expect it is." They sat with that for a long moment, and it was the best kind of silence, the kind that does not need to be filled because it already contains something. "I'm not looking to be taken care of," she said carefully. "I want to make that clear." "I know that," he said with absolute seriousness. "I wouldn't take you for a woman who needed it. But I don't mind someone looking out for me," she said, "when it comes from the right place." "What's the right place?" he asked. She looked at him across the table in the warm light, this large, quiet man who had come down from his mountain to stand beside her without being asked, who had built her a fence that would hold for 20 years, who had eaten her cooking without ceremony and spoken to her as an equal from the first moment and listened to everything she said and looked at her like she was something worth looking at. "I think you know," she said. He breathed in slowly through his nose. "I think I might," he said, "but I'd rather not presume." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was large and warm and work-roughened and utterly still under her touch. "Don't presume," she said. "Just know." He turned his hand under hers so that his palm faced up, and his fingers curled gently around hers, and the feeling of that was so unexpectedly right, so quietly and completely right, that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. He left later that night up the ridge trail, and this time when she watched him go from the cabin door, she did not feel the night close around her like something isolating. She felt it settle around her like something warm. The second thing that happened in July was that Harlan Creek had a summer social, which Mabel Hutchins organized on the first Saturday of the month, as she apparently did every year, setting up long tables outside the schoolhouse and inviting every family and person in the surrounding area. People came from as far as 12 miles in every direction, by wagon and by horse and by foot, and the main road through town filled up with people and horses and the sound of a fiddle and the smell of food. Eliza went because Mabel asked her to come and bring something, and she had made 2 apple pies with the dried apples and a pot of bean soup with herbs from the garden. She walked into town carrying the pies in a basket and found the whole event already in full, noisy, warm-hearted swing. She met more people in 3 hours than she had in the entire previous month, farm families and miners, and the school teacher, a quiet young man from Ohio named Mr. Harper, and several older women who gathered around her with the friendly, evaluating warmth of people who are glad to have a new face in the community. Colt Mercer arrived an hour after she did, and she saw him before he saw her, crossing the main road with 2 haunches of smoked venison slung over one shoulder, bringing them to the food tables with the unhurried ease of someone doing a thing they do every year without requiring notice. He was bigger than almost every other man at the gathering, and the people around him moved slightly to make room without seeming to notice they were doing it. That involuntary spatial adjustment that happens around someone whose physical presence simply commands a little more of the world. He found her at the food tables, his green eyes locating her through the crowd with what she suspected was less accident than it appeared. He set down the venison and came over and stood beside her, and they stood together, talking and watching the gathering and sharing plates of food, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and she was aware of the way it looked to the people around them, and she found she did not mind that at all. Mabel Hutchins appeared at her elbow at some point during the afternoon, with a look on her face that was simultaneously innocent and triumphant. "I see you've introduced yourself to Colt Mercer," Mabel said, in a tone so carefully neutral it could only mean the opposite. "He helped me build my garden fence," Eliza said, matching her tone exactly. "Did he?" Mabel said. "That was very neighborly of him." "Very," Eliza agreed. Mabel's mouth twitched. "He's never helped anyone build anything before," she said, and drifted away before Eliza could respond. In the late afternoon, when the fiddle struck up a dance tune and people began moving the tables aside to clear a space, Colt appeared at her side and said quietly, "I am not a good dancer." "Neither am I," she said. "Then we're even," he said, and held out his hand. He was not, in fact, a terrible dancer. He was stiff and careful in the beginning, clearly more comfortable with physical work than with the formalized intimacy of a dance. But she was small and light, and led him through it gently by the pressure of her hand, and he followed her direction, and by the second song, they were moving together well enough that she found herself laughing at something he said. And the laugh surprised her by how easy it was, how completely unguarded, and she saw him watching her laugh with an expression so warm and undefended that she had to look away again to manage herself. The third thing that happened in July was smaller and more private than either of the others, but in some ways, it mattered most of all. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of July, she was working in the garden in the early morning light, on her knees among the tomatoes, when she heard him on the trail and looked up, and he was coming down with a piece of equipment over his shoulder that she recognized after a moment as a grafting saw for fruit trees. "I was clearing timber up by the North Hollow," he said, setting the saw against the fence, "and I found something I thought you should see." She pulled off her gloves and followed him up the trail, through the cool forest morning, to a place on the north slope of the ridge where the firs gave way to a mixed stand of aspen and birch, and, tucked back against the rock face in a south-facing pocket that caught and held the warmth, a cluster of old apple trees. They were wild trees, gnarled and unpruned, clearly old enough to have been growing before any white settler had put roots in this valley, possibly planted by someone she would never know. But they were loaded in the green heavy way of July apple trees, with the first small, hard apples of the season. "Wild apples," she said. "They'll ripen in September," he said. "Good cooking apples, a little tart, but they make good preserves. I've taken a basket of them every year, but I thought, with your garden and all, you'd want to know they were here." She stood looking at the trees in the dappled morning light, the apples dense and green among the leaves, the rock face warm behind them, and felt something come together inside her in a quiet, certain way, the sense of being in exactly the right place. "This is my valley," she said, and she meant it in the deepest way, not possessively but intimately, the way you mean it when you say "this is my home" and feel the words resonate in your bones. "Yes," he said, standing beside her in the warm morning light. "It is." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the trees smelled of green growing things, and the light was sweet and dappled on his dark hair and the line of his shoulder, and she said, "Colt," and he said, "Eliza," at the same moment, and then they both stopped. He reached out and pushed a strand of hair back from her face with one large, careful finger, tucking it behind her ear, and the gentleness of it, coming from such a large and powerful man, made her eyes sting in a way she had not expected. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, with the direct simplicity of a man who means exactly what he says. "If you're willing." "I am willing," she said, "very." He smiled then, which was not something he did often, and which, when he did it, changed his whole face into something that she thought she could look at for a very long time. What followed was the courtship, which was conducted with the same thoughtful seriousness that Colt brought to everything. He came down from the ridge 4 or 5 evenings a week, sometimes staying for supper and talking long into the night, sometimes bringing things. A brace of grouse he had taken on the trapline, a bundle of the wild herbs he knew she used in cooking, once a carefully dried and pressed wildflower from the high meadow above the snow line, which he gave her without any explanation, and with a faint flush across his cheekbones that made her love him more than she had expected. She, in turn, brought him things from the garden as it grew, delivering them up the ridge trail herself in a basket, the first tomatoes when they ripened in early August, warm and red and smelling of summer, sitting at his rough-hewn table drinking his strong black coffee while he ate the tomatoes directly from the basket, with a look of such genuine pleasure that she felt like she had given him something much more valuable than produce. He showed her the trapline in stages, taking her out in the early mornings when the light was new and the mountain was at its most itself, silent and vast and perfectly alive. She learned the names of the animals by their tracks, the wide flat prints of the beaver, the delicate small prints of the marten, the deep-pressed 5-toed mark of the black bear along the creek bank. She learned to move quietly in the forest, to read the wind, to stand very still and wait for the world to forget she was there. He learned the garden in stages, too, accompanying her in the evenings when she did her rounds, checking each bed, staking the tomatoes as they grew taller, pinching the suckers on the squash vines, tying the bean plants to the fence rails. He was a quick study with plants, as he was with most things, and within 2 weeks he could tell the difference between a healthy tomato leaf and one showing the early signs of blight, and he applied himself to the garden's welfare with the same quiet, methodical care he brought to everything. In August, the garden was in full production, and it was, frankly, magnificent. The tomatoes were heavy on the vines, red and yellow, and the deep purple of the variety she had carried from Virginia. The beans were climbing 8 feet up the fence rails in a dense green curtain and producing more than she could eat fresh, so she began preserving them in the salt crocks she had bought from Mabel, 4 crockfuls in the first 2 weeks. The squash had taken over its entire corner and sent vines reaching hopefully toward the gate, and the herbs were so full and fragrant that some evenings she could smell them from inside the cabin with the windows closed, and the deer had not touched any of it. Every morning she walked the fence line and looked at the undisturbed earth inside it, the neat rows, the undamaged plants, and felt a fierce, quiet joy. She had found the tracks outside the fence several times, the pressed earth where they came down the run from the ridge, and walked along the outside of the cedar rails, testing, nosing, looking for a gap that was not there. And every morning they had turned back. She told Colt about the tracks one evening, and he nodded with the expression of a man who has been quietly keeping track of something himself. "I've seen them from the ridge," he said. "Big doe and her yearling mostly, and a young buck with one bent antler. They come down every night around dusk." "But they can't get in," she said. "They cannot," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice that she recognized because she felt it herself. August moved into September with the slow, brilliant shift of a mountain autumn, the aspens going gold and the air acquiring a clean sharpness that you could feel in your lungs. They harvested the wild apples together, filling 4 baskets that they carried down from the ridge on a bright September morning. And she spent 3 days making preserves, the kitchen fragrant with sugar and cinnamon and the sweet tart steam of simmering apple, and she gave Colt 4 jars to take back up the ridge, and he accepted them with the careful handling of someone receiving something precious. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday evening in the middle of September in the garden, as they were walking the fence line in the late golden afternoon light. He said it simply and without preamble, standing by the east corner, the deer run corner, the corner he had built most carefully, and he said, "Eliza, I believe I love you. I know that is plain speaking, but I don't know any other kind. and I would like to marry you, if you'll have me, and I will spend whatever time I am given making sure you never regret it." She had been expecting it, and not expecting it, the way you can know something is coming and still be entirely overwhelmed when it arrives. She stood looking at him in the gold September light, at the breadth of his shoulders and the green of his eyes, and the careful, earnest expression on his face. This large, quiet, good man who had come down from his mountain and built something solid around the thing she was growing. And she thought about her mother's garden and her father's land, and the seeds she had carried for 2 years, and the morning she had arrived in Harlan Creek with nothing but a carpet bag, and the kind of stubborn determination that people mistake for coldness. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I'll have you, and I already know I won't regret it." He took her face in both hands, gently, with the same careful calibration of his strength that she had noticed the first day she met him, and kissed her. And the kiss was warm and slow and full of the particular tenderness of someone who has been wanting something for a long time and is now allowing themselves to have it. They were married in October at the Harlan Creek schoolhouse on a Saturday morning when the aspens were at the height of their gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming cold. Mabel Hutchins cried, which surprised everyone, including Mabel. The schoolteacher, Mr. Harper, read the service. There were perhaps 20 people there from the valley, everyone who mattered in the small world of Harlan Creek, and afterward there was a meal at the long tables outside, despite the October chill, with Eliza's preserved tomatoes and beans alongside a venison roast that Colt had spent 3 days preparing, slow-cooked over a stone oven he had built specifically for the purpose, and it was the best meal anyone in Harlan Creek could remember eating in a long time. He moved down from the ridge in November, bringing his tools and his hides and his trapping equipment down in 3 loads and settling into the Calloway cabin with the careful, quiet ease of someone who has finally found the place they were always heading toward. The cabin was small for 2 people, and they began talking immediately about expanding it, an extra room to the north side where the soil was firm, a larger kitchen, a covered porch facing the garden. He built it over the winter, on the days when the weather allowed. He worked with the same focused, powerful efficiency that he brought to everything physical, hauling the logs himself from the timber he felled on the upper ridge, notching them with an axe in the cold air, fitting the walls up log by log. She worked alongside him when she could and cooked for him and kept the fire going and measured things and handed him tools and held the beam ends while he spiked them. And the new room went up through December and was roofed and chinked by January, smelling of fresh-cut wood and cold air. That winter was the hardest she had experienced in Montana, the snows coming deep and the temperatures dropping to things she had not believed possible when she had lived in Virginia. There were nights when the wind came down off the peaks and drove the snow horizontal against the cabin walls, and the temperature inside dropped to where you could see your breath even with the stove stoked full. He slept with one arm around her and his body curved around hers, and the warmth of him was like a wall between her and the cold, and she lay in the dark, listening to the wind and the sound of his steady breathing, and felt safer than she had felt anywhere in her life. He ran the trap line in short circuits that winter, not going as far as he had in previous years when he had been alone, staying closer to the valley and the cabin. He came in each evening with snow on his shoulders and the cold smell of the high forest on his coat, and she had coffee and food ready, and they ate together and talked by the fire in the evenings, reading from the small collection of books she had brought from Virginia, and that he had quickly absorbed with the appetite of a man who had spent too many solitary winters without enough to read. She read to him sometimes, particularly when he was doing work with his hands, mending trap chains or sharpening blades or braiding rope, and he would work and listen with complete attention, asking questions sometimes that showed he had been thinking about what she read with the same focused intelligence he brought to everything else. She had not expected, when she came to Harlan Creek, to find someone so genuinely interested in ideas, and the discovery of it continued to surprise and delight her through the whole of that long winter. In the spring, Mabel Hutchins, who could not leave things unsaid for longer than was absolutely necessary, pulled Eliza aside one afternoon in the general store and said with beaming directness that she had always known from the day Eliza arrived that the 2 of them would end up exactly here, and she considered herself at least partially responsible for the union, which Eliza admitted was technically fair given that Mabel had been the one to mention Colt's name on that first afternoon. "How is he?" Mabel asked in the particular tone that means, "How are you both, really?" "He is wonderful," Eliza said, and meant it without qualification or reservation. Spring came again to the valley in the way of mountain springs, sudden and complete, and Eliza opened up the garden fence gate on the first warm morning of April, with the particular feeling of returning to something beloved after an absence. The soil was dark and ready. The cedar fence had weathered its first full year without a single post shifted, the rails still tight in their mortises, the corners still square and plumb. She walked the inside of it with her hands trailing over the rails, and thought about everything that had happened since the morning she had stood in the same clearing with her measuring rope and her sketched plans. She planted the garden again that spring, expanding it this time, taking down one section of fence and extending it outward to incorporate another 10 feet of ground to the south. Colt built the new section in a single day, matching the original perfectly, the new cedar posts going in with the same methodical precision, the rails fitted with the same tight mortising that would hold through whatever the years brought. He built the matching section as though he had been building fences for her his whole life, which was not true but which felt somehow inevitable. And when the last rail was fitted and he tested the new corner with his full weight and it did not give a fraction of an inch, he turned and found her watching him from inside the fence with an expression that made him put down his mallet and walk over to her and take her face in his hands and kiss her in the late afternoon light for no stated reason, except that the moment called for it. "Is it right?" he asked, meaning the fence. "It's perfect," she said, meaning something larger than the fence. That second summer in the garden was the best one yet. The expanded plot yielded so much that she began selling the surplus through Mabel's general store, tomatoes and beans and squash and bundles of dried herbs that Mabel sold quickly and asked for more of, and the small income from the garden began to add up to something meaningful alongside what Colt brought in from the trap line and the occasional timber work he took on for the neighboring farms. They had begun to talk about cattle, a small herd, just enough to work with, learning the land over a few seasons before expanding. There was grazing on the south-facing slope below the ridge that was as good as any she had seen, and the water from Dawson's Fork was reliable year-round. It was the slow, real building of a life, one careful decision at a time, without haste, and without any of the desperate grasping that had characterized so much of what she had seen other people do out here in the territory. The deer still came down the run from the ridge every evening. She saw them sometimes from the kitchen window in the long summer dusks, the doe and her grown yearling and the young buck with the bent antler moving through the aspen grove to the south, making their way along the fence line, noses pressed to the cedar rails. And they always turned back. Every single time. She was standing at the window watching them one evening, the late light coming golden through the aspens, when Colt came up behind her and rested his hands on her shoulders and looked out the window over her head. "Still coming," he said. "Every night," she said, "and the fence holds." "Every night," she said again, and leaned back slightly against him and felt the solid warmth of him at her back. They stood together watching the deer move along the fence line in the golden light, and there was something about it, the persistence of the deer and the permanence of the fence, that felt like a parable she did not need to explain to him because they both already understood it. "I was thinking," he said after a while, in the particular careful tone that meant he had been thinking about it for longer than just now, "that we might start looking at acquiring the Hendersons' parcel to the north. They've been talking about moving to Oregon. It would give us the grazing land we need for a proper small herd." "How many acres?" 65. Good grass on the lower portion, timber on the upper. Fresh spring on the north edge. She considered it, watching the deer outside. "What do they want for it?" "They haven't set a firm number, but I think we could reach an agreement." He paused. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to build something here that lasts, something that's ours." She turned to face him and looked up at the strong lines of his face, the green eyes, the dark hair that was a little longer than when she had first met him, brushing his collar in the way she had come to love. She thought about her father coming west alone with a dream and building a cabin and a piece of land, and her mother's garden in Virginia, and the seeds she had carried 2,000 miles in a small cloth bag, and the fence they had built together that had held against everything the mountains sent down. "It's already ours," she said. "We just need to keep building it." He pulled her close with one arm, the way he always did, with that gentle management of his own enormous strength that she had stopped noticing as something remarkable, because it had become simply the way he was. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the whole solid reality of him, and the land outside, and the garden inside its fence, and the mountains beyond, and thought that nothing was missing. Autumn came again, and they harvested the wild apples for the second time, filling 6 baskets this time because she had gone up in July and pruned the old trees back and given them some care, and they had responded by producing more abundantly. She made preserves and apple butter and dried apple slices and a syrup that Colt declared was the best thing he had ever eaten on a biscuit, which made her laugh and make another jar of it on the spot. In November, a year after their marriage, she told him she was going to have a child. He was at the splitting stump when she told him, in the middle of an axe stroke that he completed before the information fully landed, and then he stood very still for a moment with the axe in his hand and his back to her, and she waited, watching him. He set the axe very carefully against the stump and turned around, and his face was the most openly feeling she had ever seen it, everything present at once, wonder and fear and joy and that particular ferocity of a man who has just been given something he had never quite let himself want. "Are you sure?" he said, which was not what he had meant to say first, she could tell. "Mabel had a look at me," she said. "She has some experience in this area." He crossed the wood yard in 3 strides and put both arms around her, carefully and entirely, the way you hold something you are afraid of damaging and afraid of letting go of. And she felt his breath release against the top of her head in a long, slow exhalation. "Eliza," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. He held her for a long time in the November wood yard with the smell of fresh split cedar around them and the mountains visible above the tree line and the cold air beginning to carry the first promise of snow. And she thought about the word home and found that it had acquired a weight and warmth that it had not had before. The winter she was expecting was gentler than the previous one, or perhaps seemed so because she was less afraid of it. Colt took meticulous care of her in the way of a man who is not fully in control of his own protectiveness, but is trying to exercise it with intelligence rather than overbearing it, bringing in firewood before she could ask, making sure the water barrel was always full, staying closer to home and running a shorter trap circuit that winter so that he was never more than half a day's travel from the cabin. She, for her part, refused to be treated as an invalid, which he respected, though he watched her from the corner of his eye when she did anything strenuous with an expression of concentration that she found more endearing than annoying most of the time. They talked about the child through that winter the way they talked about everything, directly and practically and full of feeling. What kind of people they wanted to be as parents, what kind of childhood they wanted to give, the things they had had and the things they had not had, and the ways those experiences shaped what mattered now. She told him about her mother and the way her mother had managed to make even difficult things feel navigable by never pretending they were less difficult than they were. He told her about his father, who had been taciturn and sometimes hard, but who had also, in his limited and gruff way, communicated very clearly that Colt mattered to him, and who had died before Colt was ready to have finished learning from him. "I want to be present," Colt said one evening, looking at the fire with the expression of a man speaking something he's been thinking about quietly for a long time. "Not just physically. Present the way your mother was, I think, where they know you're paying attention to who they actually are." "You already do that," she said. "You do that with everything." He glanced at her and she watched the plain truth of that reflection land on him and watched him take it in. In March, 2 weeks before the last of the snow left the upper peaks, their son was born. Mabel Hutchins came out from town to help, arriving the day before, which was exactly the right amount of advance notice because the baby was not inclined to be hurried. It was a long night and a harder morning, and Colt spent most of it on the other side of the bedroom door, doing the things that needed doing, hauling water and keeping the fire, and occasionally sitting in complete stillness with his hands on his knees and his eyes closed in a way that Mabel, coming out once for more water, recognized as a man praying without words. The baby arrived in the full light of a late March morning when the sky outside the cabin windows was the particular clear blue of winter finally giving way, and he came into the world with the indignant conviction of someone who had been somewhere warm and did not see why he should have had to leave. He was large, as Mabel noted with some frankness, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, a brown so warm it was almost amber, and when Colt was allowed into the bedroom and sat carefully on the edge of the bed and took his son in his arms for the first time, the look on his face was something Eliza knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "He's perfect," Colt said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, stripped of everything except the plain, overwhelmed truth of it. "He is," she said. They named him Martin Colt Mercer, Martin for her father, Colt because the boy was his father's son, and because the name already meant something in this valley that it would carry forward well. Little Martin grew through his first spring and summer with the appetite and velocity of someone trying to make up for lost time. By summer, he was sitting up in the basket. She sat in the shade inside the fence while she worked in the garden, watching everything with his amber eyes and reaching for the bean plants that swayed within his reach. By autumn, he was pulling himself along the fence rails with the focused determination that already looked, she thought, very much like his father. Colt finished building the porch that summer, the covered porch facing the garden, and in the evenings they sat on it together with Martin between them or in Colt's arms, watching the light move across the fence and the garden inside it and the mountains beyond. The deer came down every evening as they always had, making their way along the fence line, and every evening the fence turned them back. They bought the Hendersons' parcel in the autumn of Martin's first year, the 65 acres to the north, with its good grass and its timber and its cold spring. And in the spring of Martin's second year, they put their first 6 cattle on the grass and watched them spread out across the slope with the proprietary calm of animals who have found good footing. The herd grew slowly and well over the following years, as they had intended, never faster than the land could support or their management could sustain. The garden expanded again in Martin's second year, and again in the year after that, until the fence enclosed an area 3 times the size of the original clearing, built outward in careful stages, each new section matching the original in the quality of its construction, the cedar posts plumb and the rails tight-fitted. Colt built every expansion himself, sometimes with Eliza measuring and marking beside him, sometimes now with Martin on his shoulder, watching the post hole digging with intense and opinionated focus. "Post," Martin said one morning at about 20 months, pointing at a fence post with great certainty. "That's right," Colt said, without looking up from the mortising. "Post." "Big," Martin said. "They need to be," Colt said. "They need to hold against a great deal." She was watching from the gate, and she felt something move deep in her chest at the sound of that exchange, at the image of the enormous, careful man and the small, certain child, at the quiet education passing between them as naturally as the morning light. Gareth Foss came back through Harlan Creek twice more over the following years, each time with better clothes and higher numbers, the railroad survey having apparently confirmed what he had suspected about the Eastern Valley's potential. Each time Colt was at the cabin when he arrived, the first time working on the porch, and the second time splitting wood in the yard. And each time, Foss took in the scene of the established homestead, the solid cabin with its addition, the large productive garden and its strong fence, the cattle on the northern pasture, the man who answered the door with quiet and unmistakable permanence, and each time he revised his approach from pressure to polite inquiry and received, politely and clearly, the same answer. Not for sale, not for any price. This is our home. The railroad did eventually come through the valley, not through the eastern parcel but through the western lowland south of town, which meant that Harlan Creek acquired a station and a degree of connection to the wider world that changed it in some ways, and, in the ways that mattered most, left it entirely itself. Mabel Hutchins expanded her store and added a small post office counter. The schoolhouse got a second room, and the schoolteacher, Mr. Harper, acquired a wife from Ohio and a slightly more appropriate teaching salary. The Broken Spur Saloon changed hands twice and eventually became a respectable enough establishment that Eliza was comfortable walking past it without averting her eyes. Their second child arrived in the spring of Martin's 4th year, A girl this time, with her father's dark hair and something in her expression from the very first days that suggested she had opinions about everything and intended to share them. They named her Clara Ruth Mercer. Clara because Eliza had always loved the name, and Ruth for Colt's mother, whom they had written to in her eastern town, and with whom Colt had slowly, carefully rebuilt a correspondence over the years of his marriage. Clara was smaller than Martin had been, but louder from the first moment, and she and Martin regarded each other across the bedroom with the complex mutual assessment of people who understand they are going to be important to each other and are just working out the terms. Martin was fiercely protective of her from the start, standing beside her basket with the particular posture, weight on both feet, chin slightly up, that was so precisely his father's that Eliza sometimes had to leave the room to laugh without hurting his feelings. Colt, for his part, handled Clara with the same gentle precision he applied to everything delicate, those enormous hands moving with such careful softness around her small body that Eliza watched it with a permanent warmth somewhere in her sternum. The garden that summer was presided over by both children in the way that gardens with small children are always managed, with enthusiastic and often counterproductive participation. Martin dug holes in places that had not been designated for hole digging. Clara ate one green tomato with an expression of complete confidence before discovering her error. Colt built a small section of low fence inside the main fence to keep Clara from crawling directly into the bean beds, which she was attempting to do with great determination, and then built a matching one for Martin, because fairness required it, even though Martin was old enough to be told about the beans and had, in fact, been told about them several times already. The seasons came and went with the comfortable rhythm of a life well anchored, each one different from the last and recognizably itself. Snow coming and going from the peaks, the aspens turning gold each October, the spring floods on Dawson's Fork each April, and then the clean high water of summer, the elk moving through the upper forest in the autumn rut, the sound of the wind in the firs at night, the garden producing year after year with the reliability of things well tended, the tomatoes and the beans and the squash and the herbs, and the apple preserves every autumn from the trees on the north slope, the trees that Eliza pruned and cared for and that responded each year with more abundance than the year before. The fence standing through all of it, never failing, never giving an inch. The deer still came down the run from the ridge every evening in the spring and summer. Some years there was a different doe or a different young buck, but the behavior never changed. The nightly circuit along the outside of the cedar rails, the testing noses and the turned-back hooves. And every year the fence held them off as completely and certainly as it had on the first night after it was finished, and the garden inside was untouched. On a warm evening in September, some years after the fence was first built, Eliza sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the last light move across the mountains. Clara was inside reading at the table with the focus of a child who has recently discovered that books were made by the same mechanisms as magic. Martin was somewhere on the northern pasture with his father, the two of them checking the cattle before the night, the last of the late sun catching them as small figures in the open grass between the aspens and the tree line. She watched Colt come back down from the pasture with Martin at his side, the boy's head at his father's waist, matching his father's long stride with the earnest exaggeration of a child who wants to move through the world exactly the way the person he loves most moves through it. They came through the aspen grove in the last of the day's light, the leaves overhead a shower of gold, and she watched them come toward the cabin in the evening quiet, with the sound of the creek behind her and the smell of the garden through the open fence gate. He saw her on the porch and raised one hand, the simple, unaffected gesture of a man who is genuinely glad to see someone every time, without diminishment or performance. She raised her cup in return. Martin ran the last stretch to the porch steps and climbed them in 2 bounds. "The brown heifer has a calf coming," he announced. "Papa says maybe tomorrow." "Is that right?" she said, pulling him in for a hug that he submitted to briefly, and then escaped from in the manner of 7-year-old boys the world over. Colt came up the porch steps and sat beside her on the bench, the wood settling under his weight, and looked out at the valley and the mountains in the evening light. She leaned against his shoulder and he curved one arm around her, and she felt the warmth of him and the solidness of him and the particular quality of being exactly where you belong with exactly the person you belong there with. "Good day?" she asked. "Good day," he said. The evening settled over the valley in long amber light. Inside, Clara turned pages. Martin was already back off the porch and investigating something near the fence with the single-minded focus of a child whose curiosity was the size of a mountain. The deer, at some point in the deepening dusk, would come down the ridge trail and walk along the fence, and the fence would hold them back as it always had, as it would go on doing, built to last by the hands of a man who had found something worth protecting and had given it his full measure of care and craft and quiet, permanent love. Eliza looked at the fence in the evening light, the cedar posts going silver with years and weather, but still absolutely plumb, the rails still tight, the corners still square and true. She thought about the morning she had stood in this clearing with her measuring rope and her sketched plans and her father's land and her mother's seeds and the stubborn determination that people mistake for coldness. She thought about the woman she had been then, alone and self-sufficient and afraid, in the way that you can be deeply afraid without ever showing it or even admitting it to yourself, afraid that the world had already given out its full allotment of good things and there was nothing left that had her name on it. She had been wrong about that, completely and wonderfully wrong. "Colt," she said. He said, looking out at the mountains. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked down at her, the green eyes warm in the last light. "I came here thinking I did not need anyone," she said, "that I was enough by myself, and the world was enough as it was, and I did not need anything more. And I was not entirely wrong about that. I was enough, but I was so much more with you. Do you understand what I mean? Not more in the sense of being completed because I was whole. More in the sense of being, I don't know, more fully what I was already." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that full, attentive quality she had loved from the first weeks, the quality of someone for whom listening is not a passive act. "I know exactly what you mean," he said, "because the same thing is true for me." She settled back against his shoulder, and he tightened his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch in the last of the September light, and it was all exactly as it was, and nothing was missing, and nothing was unfinished, and the fence stood around the garden in the evening dusk as solid and true as the day it was built, keeping out everything that would have taken the growing things apart, and inside it, the garden was alive and full and producing with the uncomplicated abundance of things that have been given the right conditions and the right protection, and have responded the only way living things know how, by becoming as fully and completely themselves as it is possible to be. Martin's voice came across the clearing, narrating something about a beetle he had found near the fence post, his commentary both detailed and urgent in the way of children who assume the world shares their scale of importance. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them to inquire about supper, with the serene expectation of someone who has every confidence the world will provide. Colt said something quiet to Clara about 10 minutes, and she accepted this and disappeared back into the lamplight interior. Martin's beetle report continued uninterrupted from somewhere near the garden gate. Eliza smiled into the warm scratch of Colt's collar and thought about everything the land had given her, and everything she had built on it, and everything she had found here that she had not known she was looking for. The mountains were turning purple in the last of the light, their peaks still holding the day's warmth in a long rose line against the sky, and the creek was running cold and clear and constant behind the cabin, and the aspens were letting go of their gold leaves one by one in the still evening air. It was exactly this. It had always been moving toward exactly this. She stayed on the porch a little longer, watching the mountains go dark and the first stars come out above the ridge, and felt the absolute settled certainty of a life built well on ground that would hold, surrounded by everything that was worth holding, knowing that the fence around the garden would keep tonight and tomorrow and every night after that, keeping the hungry world from reaching the tender things within, and that the man beside her would do the same, with the same craft and care and absolute permanence, for all the days that remained.